it's a real pleasure to follow that extraordinary presentation, and I can't say too clearly just how significant it is to have that new temple and sanctuary of that date. That's hugely exciting. All of us who visited Poseidon will have some memories about the place. It is a place that generates memories from Goethe onwards. My connection was an annual visit when I was director of the British School at Rome to the Borsa Mediterranea del Turismo Archeologico, which is this wonderful occasion right at the end of the tourist season, where all the people who've been working so very, very hard in Italy and elsewhere to take people like us around and show us the sights get to have a week together to relax, to share their stories, to fill their hotels of Poseidon for one last week of income, and present actually in an extraordinarily vibrant way the work that they do. It's a kind of valorizzazione della valorizzazione, if you like. It's a way of valorizing the whole business of Italy's success in presenting its archaeology, and few sites do that more evocatively than Poseidon. What Lena and I are going to do today is to focus on a particular inscription, which Lena will speak more around, which comes from not about 500, so around the point where they've got that refoundation of the temple, which is the moment where the Sybarites make Poseidonia guardians and guarantors of their friendship with a group called the Serdaioi. So what I want to do to begin with is just to try to frame up this conversation a little bit more methodologically. What I'm really interested in is the role of religion in a site which is named after Poseidon. So what does it actually mean to live in a city which is named after a god? Not all cities are by any means. There are some famous ones, but not all. And the mechanism that I want to think about is just the notion of living with religion, living with not theologies and dogmas and the institutional settings, but more the actual focus of the religion, the kinds of practices that left all those votive deposits in a later period, the kind of environment which allowed a city to have now 4 very significant temples at quite an early phase in its life, certainly 2 right at the very beginning. What are the kinds of symbolic performance that's going on? And I want to link that then to issues around what we know about the site. So let's start off with the foundation. So this is taken from Strabo, translated by Apothecary. And you have here our best guess at what was going on when the city was founded. Now, we can spend time, of course, worrying about Strabo's source material, how he actually knows this and what faith we can put with it. But the key thing here is this bit about the Sybarites founding the city with fortifications on the coast. And then those who had been resettled there moved higher up. We don't quite know what higher up means, but what would appear to be the case is that we need to think not just about the site of Poseidon, but about the bay as a whole. And we'll see an image of that in a moment, possibly quite soon. There we go. So we need to think about earlier settlements at the Horion Fociselle, which is a little earlier. You see the dotted map that marks the original coastline. So you can see bits and pieces of Poseidonia and the challenges there. And Agropoli also comes in, which may be the site of the missing Poseidon temple. So we need to think much more about the bay of Poseidon rather than just about the city, important though that critically was. And if we start thinking about some of the connections, and I'll do this very quickly because you know most of these stories. Poseidon, of course, is well associated with walls. He's the builder of the wall at Troy. Iliad Book 7 alludes to the famous story that Poseidon and Apollo laboured to build Troy's wall for Laomedon, who then fails to pay them. Poseidon as a city founder, Poseidon competed with Athena for the foundation of Athens, and is still visible in, Athena wins, but Poseidon is still visible on the Acropolis in the Erechtheion, and critically that fundamental port temple of Cape Sunion. The reason why Tiziano thought maybe that this was Poseidon, maybe it's still down there at Agropoli. We also have some indications that when we think about how the foundation, the foundation of the temple, who founds the temple at Foce del Sele, it is supposed to be Jason. Jason the Argonauts, the other great epic of the time, are connected with Corinth, and then Poseidon again, who has a famous temple in Corinth, and the Argo, the ship of Jason, is dedicated to Poseidon at the end of their great journey. So what we've got is a sort of set of stories which are taking Poseidon and the deep past and connecting them with this particular foundation. If we look at Poseidon and the Achaeans, this Poseidon is an Achaean colony, if we look at what Poseidon does in Achaea, he and Zeus tend to dominate the cults of Achaea. It's Hera who then comes over here. So we've got this kind of rather strange transition between different deities. I think we can spend a little bit of time thinking about the fact that polytheism allows for a really interesting set of lived religions. You can play games as you swap between who is your hero god, why, what is it that they're symbolizing, what it is that you are carrying through by using them. And it's interesting that whilst all of the material culture that we see running through the site, the terracottas that we've seen there and in other sites in Paestum, etc., don't play a strong line to Poseidon, the coinage does. So whatever else is happening, the people of Poseidonia are able to hold in their minds both Poseidon and a whole range of other gods, and to use this panoply of divinity and their place within a phenomenally rich mythological landscape, play those things together. Now, there is a possible parallel to this kind of bay with Poseidon and notions of divinity, which is the site of Achaean Troidzon. So, as I said, Paestum is an Achaean colony, and if we go into what's happening in Troidzon, and this area, which you can see is a bay, we have a whole bunch of similar kinds of conversations, deep connections to myth history, multiple stories and foundations. Strabo says that Achaean Troidzon was also called Poseidonia, and it's interestingly known for an asylum temple and connected to a whole range of activities around the bay, with Kalauria being very important. One of the sanctuaries is Poseidon Phytalmios, the nurturer, a sanctuary outside the city, which makes us think back to Agropoli. And that, we're told, Phytalmius Poseidon was important because he was a saviour of vegetation from salt water. Phytalmius nourishing from plant and sea water. Pausanias points out the problem that we've got, Troidzon, is saltwater penetrations of the Chora. So saltwater coming in and affecting the vegetation, and Poseidon saves it. We also know that actually Paestum has quite significant challenges with water and with the ways that it manages its vegetation. Hans Beck, in talking about Troidzon, draws out of this a lengthy quote, which I didn't give you because it was too long. What he's talking about here is the connection between natural environment, the Troidzonian countryside, harbour, bay, an entire ritual space contiguous between land and sea interacting with each other. And really importantly, processions across the landscape of this sacred area. Now, one of the interesting things about Paestum is that it's always been brought out, the connection between the Heraeon Futricelle and Poseidonia is one of the examples that Francois de Polignac uses for this kind of idea of bipolar cities that have sanctuary inside and a sanctuary outside, and a relationship between the two expressing the nature of a broader territory. So we've got the same phenomena being lived through by inhabitants who are walking across this landscape, engaging with it and thinking about it through its religion. So what I'm endeavouring to say here is that we have a deeply religious landscape right across, in which Poseidon may have had an interesting relationship because of the name, but other deities are brought through. Just to finish my part of this, although Paestum lacks so far an evident Poseidon temple in the city, and Troezen too, Poseidon himself as a deity is interestingly connected with issues of sanctuary and asylum. So there are a number of ways, the Spartan earthquake, which is blamed on ejecting helots from the Poseidon sanctuary, various other suggestions. So Poseidon is an interesting deity in terms of his sanctuary connections, and maybe that gives us some kind of sense of another layer to the rich history here. Now I'm going to stop there and pass over to Lena.
Then you're going to come back, right?
I'm not going to move away. I'm just going to sit in the corner over here.
So just also in terms of everybody's got stories, I hope, about Paestum, which is one of my absolute favorite sites, so much that I've ended up spending a lot of my life kind of looking at this region. So it's very exciting to come back to it. And I've dragged students there who were just absolutely shocked that they didn't know about it. So it's wonderful to see this new material coming through. What I'm doing is, is going to focus on one inscription, which has kind of, in talking with Christopher and thinking about what Tiziana might talk about and Catherine is going to talk about later on, I just thought I want to revisit this and think of this in that context. Also because it's a slightly earlier period than I usually work on. So the inscription was found at Olympia, so quite away from this region. And it's a treaty between, as Christopher said, Sybaris and the Sardaioi, and it's dated somewhere between 550 to 500 BC, more likely towards the end of that period. Just very quickly, what it says is, the Sybarites and their allies and the Sardaioi made an agreement for friendship, faithful and without guile forever, guarantors, Zeus, Apollo, and the other gods, and city Poseidonia. But I'll come back to that very last bit. So this inscription was, it seems, was found in the 4th century BC Phil and the Stadium of Olympia. It was probably part of the Sybarite treasury that is there. And when I say the original, the question is, what came to me is, well, you deposit things in sanctuaries, as we know, like Delphi and Olympia, usually copies of something that is somewhere else. So the question becomes, where was the original? Would it have been among the Sardaioi somewhere in Sybaris, or perhaps in Poseidonia, or maybe even at the Agropoli sanctuary, if it was Poseidon. But in either case, we don't know what that is, but we might want to think of this as a copy of somewhere else. I have no evidence for this, of course, but we're going to return to the guarantors. The other inscription I want to point out is, so the thing to note is this is one of the oldest treaty inscriptions we have anywhere in the Greek context. That's what makes it so particularly amazing. One that seems to be slightly older is the one I've got here, which is another treaty. It's between two communities, Anaitoi and Metaipioi, of which we know nothing else, dated to around the mid-6th century, also from Olympia. And it says retra, so it's another kind of, if you like, contract or treaty between the Anaitoi and Metaipioi, philia for the 50 years, so similar use as the word in our Sybaris inscription. And if either side should violate the compact, let both of the proxenoi, this will become important later, and the priest expel them from the altar. If they transgress their oath, the judgment shall belong to the priest of Olympia. Okay, so I'm not going to spend much time on this, fun as it would be, but we will be coming back and forth to it a little bit. So it has slightly different phrasing. and seems to be situated after a conflict, unlike, I would argue, the Sybaris one. So the Sybaris Treaty has a different tone to it and is rather more about shoring up the allies. And I kind of look to you, and I know some of you, and you will know much more about the Greek of this period than I do. So anything that you have afterwards, which might be different, or you might think of something, it would be wonderful to have your views about this. So the point of the shoring up in this particular period, so we're at the cusp of the end of the 6th, beginning of the 5th century BC, is precisely because the world is becoming more interesting, a bit more unstable, or a lot more ambitious figures are coming to meet in possibly the same geographical places. And of course, what we do know from the historians is that in 510 BC, possibly just after this was put up, maybe anticipating it, Croton destroyed Sybaris. So here we are in a world of competition, particularly in South Italy, or at least how we see some of these things playing out. Again, just to note again, this is some of the earliest treaties that we have anywhere in the Greek context appearing here in Olympia. So for us, for the purpose of today, is what was Poseidonia's role? And how does this inscription perhaps help us to understand its role in the region in Italy, in terms of the balance of power between Sybaris and her allies? So just very quickly to mention the Sardaii, I don't want to spend too much time on them. They are thought to be associated, there's a lot of debates where they come from, Sardinia, not Sardinia, but Sardaii may be the same group that produced coinage with Sard on them, or maybe merged, stamped in the late 6th, early 5th centuries BC, and they seem to have occupied the Tyrrhenian coast between Poseidonia and Vibo, so in the area between Sybaris and Poseidonia. And there's also possibly some suggestion of similarities of coin types between the Sardaii and Poseidonia itself. So on the Olympia Treaty, we also have these allies, and they may be the people that Strabo mentions in his 6th book, being the 25 subject cities. And the Sardaii are kind of uplifted from that group and are in addition to it. So we come back to Poseidonia. So that very final line listing the guarantors, of course, Poseidonia appears among the gods. And some have speculated, Van der Terre and Ruse have suggested the lack of article in front of Poseidonia makes it perhaps the object of the inscription and maybe even attesting to its original foundation. Greco has a different view, and some others, where the focus is on the mediating role of the relationship. And perhaps there's some kind of relation to the founding of Laos, another city in the period, especially as Herodotus writes that the Sybarite refugees settled in Laos after the destruction of their own city in 510. So in other words, this treaty, again, would have come just before this very kind of cataclysmic moment for Sybaris and her allies at that time. We have no direct evidence for either of these theories, so I'll just leave them with you there. But we can have a little bit of a go at a more literal translation, and just going back to the lack of article. So if Poseidonia is adjectival, it could also mean city of Poseidon or city sacred to Poseidon, and we could play with that there, right? Rather than just city Poseidon without the there. So I've put that in there for English, but you could kind of remove that. And as I say, that's as much as I really have to say about it. We might think of city names like Olympia and what happens there. But anyways, I'll leave that there. I want to focus a little bit on the terminology. So the pact and the term philotes is not something that we see very commonly, and it begins to be replaced by the retra, which we see in the later inscription here. In fact, both of those terms are used in the mid-6th century BC inscription. The other thing to note is the terminology that we find here, it has some Homeric echoes. Again, not things that we see very much going forward in other kind of treaty inscriptions of this type. So the pact between Hector and Ajax is expressed in similar terms in Homer's Iliad. And again, Santiago Alvarez is somebody who plays around with some of these ideas. So the diversity in the phrasing of these early inscriptions is interesting because what it suggests is that here we have a practice or an institution that is kind of in the process of formation. There's a lot of flexibility and experimentation with how you might express something, which later on becomes more standardized, and both in terms of the terminology, but also in terms of the protocols. And this is where we come back again to the guarantors, who are named proxenoi or proxenos. So ancient agreements, just very briefly, about guarantors and witnesses, whether they were gods or influential individuals, and in our case, a city, they ensured the reliability and enforced any pact or treaty, or the fact that it should be enforced. They were invoked to guarantee the trustworthiness as both custodians and protectors. So they provided a kind of safeguard against any violations and ensured that both parties respected the terms of the treaty. And in the Homeric epics, the gods are the ones often called to witness a pact. So this gave it a divine sanction, and also made it inviolable, ensuring that any transgression would result in divine punishment. So that's about the notion of guarantors and witnesses. The other thing you might think about is the term, so proxenia. Proxenia as an institution, which you might know much better from slightly later period, is an honorific status that is granted by polis to xenoi, or foreigners, in gratitude for the service that a foreigner might perform on behalf of the city where they are guests, possibly in their own community that they come from. So it's about a friendship between a polis and a proxenos. Now, etymologically, proxenos is obviously linked to xenos, which is a foreigner. So it begins to take on this unusual, or at least to us it seems unusual, meaning of a witness. And that we already see forming in the Homeric epics, where those two might be used interchangeably. So marturos is the term for witness, and those two are used in kind of the same contexts. I should say that our earliest reference to a proxenos is actually a funerary epigram that is outside of the epics, which dates the 7th century BC. And this is the one dedicated in Corfu by the Corcyraeans to Menacrates of Anateia. And this massive tomb, monumental tomb, is to their beloved proxenos. So what the Sybarite decree of friendship from Olympia shows us here is that we see a transformation in the use of proxenos to mean guarantor and witness in institutional decrees. So in a way, what we're finding, if we think of it as a kind of a line from the epics, is perhaps traditions that were associated with family and hospitality that are starting to translate into something now held by public institutions and are controlled by the polis. So the guarantors, again, are various gods and the city. What's interesting in this inscription, in the mid-6th century one, is that the proxenoi are not named. But it is the priests who are carrying out the justice and who become the judges of any transgression. The Sybaris inscription is much more general than that. And here we might try to think of what are the different roles that somebody like, or something like the city of Poseidonia might play other than the gods. So the gods might be there to ensure the pact is being religiously situated and therefore inviolable, while the city of Poseidonia enforces the material maintenance of such an alliance. So does it have a similar role to that of the priests in the other inscriptions? Or more precisely, if we think about the priests, are they the priests who are responsible for it of Apollo, Zeus, and of Poseidon? Or are they those who are responsible for the magistrates of Poseidonia? So this kind of relationship between magistrates, priests, the city, and the gods. And the inscription may encompass some of the tensions between divine and secular authority that we see emerging, particularly in the tragedies, in a slightly later age. So, for instance, the request for refuge into a city might have had different kind of complex consequences. Either you'd have brought the wars from the people from whom these suppliants might have been trying to escape on the one hand, but if you did not support the suppliants, you might have the wrath of the gods upon you, which Christopher mentioned. So some final reflections on the role of Poseidonia as guarantor, as perhaps suggested by this inscription. The one thing that we assume for a guarantor is that they must have been accepted by both parties and would have had the interest of each equally in mind, so somewhat neutral like the gods. and they did not deceive with bad faith or negligence either the entities whose tasks were being carried out or that of one's own city. So the proxenos is a kind of intermediary. So did Poseidonia have shared interests equally of the Serdaioi and of Sybaris and the allies? And what kind of tools would it have had as a guarantor to keep all parties to account? Both of these, whatever the answers might be, suggest that we need to really think about Poseidon as having some kind of autonomous power, and perhaps that in connection with carrying out the will of the divine through either its magistrates or its priests. The other thing to note here is that because it lies outside as a guarantor, it is also not part of the allies, we assume, that are connected to Sybaris. So that is something else we might want to think about. So the sanctuaries within Poseidonia would have sanctioned their ability for Poseidon or for the priests and magistrates to carry out this kind of duty. And the connection with Poseidon as one of the protectors of people seeking refuge and asylum is also in itself interesting here. Because one of the other things we wonder about is this was a sanctuary. If there was a sanctuary nearby or in the city, wherever it was, is one of the things that Poseidonia is situating itself with is itself being inviolable. Now, I don't know enough about that in this period, but by the time we get to the 4th century, plenty of places are desperate to kind of have themselves deemed as inviolable, precisely as neutral entities that may not be attacked. And we have a lot of inscriptions around that and lots of other activity going on, particularly from the 4th century BC. So kind of final observations that I'll kind of leave you with. So what does it suggest about the relationship between the responsibilities between human and the divine on the one hand? So civic rules and the rules of the gods, how are those in conflict on the one hand, but also maybe how something like a city is trying to work them out here. And the final image that I've got is just to situate this a little bit more in the Italian context. So I've pulled out just a few treaties or things that we might think of in terms of friendship and pacts. There's the famous Pyrgi sanctuary of Caere, the gold plaques of Unia Strate, which is written in Phoenician and Etruscan, ritually deposited Temple B around this time. And it too is something of a shoring up of relationships. So it is not something that happens after a conflict, but if anything, is between allies in making their position and commitment to each other stronger. Of course, the Romano-Carthaginian treaties that are mentioned by Polybius in his book 3. And again, the first two are not post-conflict, but again, about shoring up and kind of knowing who you're going to be associated with and your allies, perhaps here Rome stepping into the vacuum possibly left by the Etruscans in their relationship with Carthage. And finally, I couldn't resist bringing this one in, again, 6th century BC, but this is possibly a tessera hospitalis. It's the backside of a boar, which says on an iron puinel from Carthage. Again, it's about guest friendship in Xenia across time and across space. And what's interesting, it's of course happening at the same time, but here we have a personal individual contract. So how did all these things sit together? And it's something that's a very powerful and interesting time. And as we saw with the sanctuary, also a time of great change, rebuilding and rethinking what the divine means in the context of Paestum. Thank you.